Kestrel Country Podcast, where we discuss the people, places, and events all around Kestrel Country. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Kestrel Country Podcast. I'm your host, Mike Church, and this week we are going to go back into the archives all the way back to Season 1, Episode 10 with Dr. Chris Schlect. This is a fun discussion about the history of our area and particularly focusing on the Nez Perce. Really fun discussion. One of the things I love about being in the real estate business is history, local history, right? History is inherent in real estate, whether you're talking about the land or the home that's been built there, who lived there before, what happened there, is always super interesting. And we love history here in Kestrel Country. So fun discussion with Dr. Chris Schlect, a little bit about also his service as a ranger in the U.S. National Park Service and some of the tours he's led down there. And he's also a fellow of history at New St. Andrews College right here in Moscow, Idaho. He received his BA of history from Wazoo, MA in history from the University of Idaho, and a PhD in history also from Washington State University. So really fun discussion, and I hope you all enjoy our trip back in time as we get back to Season 1, Episode 10 with Dr. Chris Schlect. Dr. Schlect, thank you for joining us today.
Good morning. It is a delight to be here.
Yeah. Well, we wanted to have you on to talk about history, because you are a history professor.
We actually both had him.
Yeah, we did.
That's right. That's like the good old days. And there will be a test at the end.
Oh, no.
We're
recording this, though. We're recording this, though, so we get an advantage.
That's right.
So, yeah, first of all, I guess tell us a little bit about what you do, who you are, and what you're doing here in Moscow.
I teach at New St. Andrews College. I'm senior fellow of history there, and I also oversee one of their graduate programs. One of the history interests that I have, among several, is to study the story of the Nez Perce people and their interaction with the Soyapo. That refers to the color of my skin and yours.
Okay.
We are white people, but the westward expansion, manifest destiny, encounters these people have been living around in these parts as long as human memory traces back. And those encounters are fascinating cultural collisions, the negotiations, the conflicts, the harmonies and arrangements that are still very much with us today, I find fascinating.
Yeah. So are you from this area? Have you always been interested in that, or has that been a more recent study for you?
Yeah, probably in the last 15 years. I did most of my growing up in Western Washington, but I have been a history guy for some 25, 30 years. And about 10 years into a career of teaching, it occurred to me that I had to become acquainted with the history in my own area. And so I felt rather chastised, actually. I'm a history guy, and I actually don't even know the history of this area. So I wound up pursuing it, and lo and behold, it actually related very closely to some research interests that I already had at that time, Presbyterian church history and church missions. And it was the Presbyterians who had mission work with the Nez Perce people. So I realized, hey, I'm studying Presbyterian and Presbyterian missions all this time, and here it is in my own backyard. And for a time, I was a park ranger for 5 or 6 years at the Nez Perce National Historical Park. So I actually got to lead tours. I continue guiding tours, school groups, and that sort of thing through Nez Perce territory.
That's awesome. Well, one of the things that I think triggered our interest in having you on was we had Dulcie Kirsting Lark from the Latah County Historical Society on. And we talked about kind of Moscow's founding, some of the stuff that came after, but it was like, well,
what happened before?
What was there before? Yeah. What was this area like before the founding of these towns and basically the westward expansion and all of that? And so I guess, can you tell us a little bit about I know it's a broad subject, but the history of the Nez Perce people in this area and what it was kind of like before all of that came about.
Right. Yeah. Dulce's great. We history people stick together. I know Dulce. Well, the Nez Perce people are fairly unique in that they have been in this area since as long as human memory traces. We know that from archaeological evidence. There's archaeological digs that have been conducted along the Clearwater and Snake Rivers and Salmon Rivers that point to human occupation that just goes way back. We also look at their storytelling lore, and a lot of Native American groups have a rich storytelling lore. The Nez Perce are no different. One of the things that's peculiar about their storytelling lore is that there are no motifs that are migration motifs, like back when we crossed the Great Waters or we came across the mountains, and that's unusual. Coupled with the fact that a lot of their ancient stories are really geographically precise. You can go to a certain spot on the Snake River, and I love to do that to recap some of these stories. You can go to certain places where Coyote did this. Their creation story is based on a site in Kamei called Heart of the Monster. And a lot of lore is kind of like a long time ago in a place far, far away.
Yeah.
And a lot of folklore is kind of like that. It's not precisely situated. And with the Nez Perce, it is a long time ago, but the place is very specific. And that's unique. And it testifies to the antiquity of these people here. They have been here, again, since as far back as human memory traces. I haven't even gotten to the story of white contact yet, but part of it is to realize that when whites came out here, they were already encountering something that's very ancient. In fact, on the tours that I lead, I point to petroglyphs on the Snake River that are as old as the Great Pyramid of Cheops.
That's crazy. Because you think of this as being so young out here in Idaho, but not realizing that we have something that's lasted that long.
That's just our history. That's young
exactly
in the area.
It's just our memory.
Yeah, man-made objects as old as the pyramids right here.
Wow.
Yep.
And what? So you lead the tours down there,
Right?
What about up on the Palouse? I mean, is there any reference going back that far to anything up here, or were there?
Yeah, so some of the bands and affiliated bands are up here. Of course, north of here we have the Coeur d'Alenes as well, but the Palouses were closely affiliated with the Nez Perce. And when I say closely affiliated, who are the Nez Perce? You can have, the Pecunins in Hell's Canyon, the Wallowas in northeastern Oregon, the Alpoas at the confluence of the Snake and Clearwater rivers. Those are their kind of group names. And then we come in and we call them all Nez Perce by clustering in our tidy minds these groups of people that are actually rather fluid. And the Palouses would certainly be in that mix.
Interesting. So what does that tour look like? I guess what are some of the sights you see or the stories? So we've kind of talked about the ancientness of them.
Right.
But then is most of the tour kind of around stuff that once white contact came in? And
yes, most of the stories that I tell, and of course that the ancient stuff contextualizes it, but the story of white contact and the story of white contact begins with Lewis and Clark. The core of the discovery came through here, and the interactions with the Nez Perce were very important to them. Then we have the fur traders who came through, and then the missionaries. And I spent a lot of time talking about the missionaries who came in the 1830s. And beyond that, we have the establishment of this place as part of the United States. This became part of the United States in 1846. And then the infrastructure and apparatus of the U.S. comes in, and that's going to lead to conflict in a war of 1877. And I tell the story of that war, too, and plenty of interactions since that time.
can you give us the
Whitebird?
Yeah.
I was thinking Whitebird.
Whitebird, which I mean, there's so many stories to tell that I've just given the low flyover here. But you want to tell me talk about the Battle of Whitebird Canyon?
Yeah. So, I mean, yeah, I know it's hard to condense, but
especially for me, there's just so much to talk about.
I know. It's like fly over at 30,000 feet and dive down in it.
Yes, it's painful. Yes. Yes. The Whitebird Canyon is, I would say, the site of the most significant battle in the Pacific Northwest, which occurred in June of 1877. And that marked the outbreak of the Nez Perce War, the U.S. government's conflict with the Nez Perce. And so at that battle, we have basically the U.S. cavalry marching down from Fort Lapway to intervene in some skirmishes between Native Americans and locals that were there. And the backstory to those skirmishes is a rich story in and of itself. But nonetheless, we have cavalry going down there and ultimately intercepting the Nez Perce in Whitebird Canyon. And it was a rout in favor of the Nez Perce. Nez Perce suffered no casualties, and about 33 men, 1/3 of the cavalry died.
Wow.
And that's significant just for the battle itself and the human tragedy that it represents, but it also is the conflict then that says, okay, now we are at war. We are at war between the United States and the Nez Perce people. And so that precipitates what's going to be, throughout the summer of 1877, this defensive march where the Nez Perce are just trying to get away from the U.S. cavalry and ultimately wind up surrendering at Bear Paw, just 40 miles south of the Canadian border.
Okay. So before that time, so 1830s to 1877, right. Had there been really very little conflict between the Nez Perce and the whites, or was there intermittent and just, I guess, what led to that conflict?
What led to that conflict? Yes, it was the cleanest way to describe it is to talk about the treaties that precipitated it, that preceded it. And there were 2 treaties with the Nez Perce. The first one in 1855, and Governor Isaac Stevens, who was the Washington Territorial Governor at the time, negotiated the treaty with the Nez Perce and had a lot of boilerplate provisions that we see. I think Stevens negotiated 11 or 12 treaties, something like that. Treaties with the Yakima, treaties with the Nez Perce, with a host of Native American groups. And the Nez Perce had the largest territory, 7.5 million acres, that includes the entire drainage of the Clearwater River, the lower Snake River through Hell's Canyon, the Wallowa territory of northeastern Oregon. And then just 5 years after that treaty was negotiated and signed, up at Pierce, gold was discovered. And that led to a gold rush by 1862. By 1862, there were probably about 13,000 whites where they shouldn't be in Nez Perce territory. And so in response to that, the United States government, it's important to contextualize here, is fighting the Civil War at this point. Back east, right. The Civil War is broken out. They have bigger fish to fry, and they just don't want problems here. So they adopt a policy to shrink the size of the reservation to 10% of its 1855 size.
Wow.
And so that leads to the Treaty of 1863. Some Nez Perce agree to it. There was probably let's not call this an even negotiation, but those who agreed to it, not sort of equal parties coming to the table, but then other Nez Perce said, well, forget it. We're not interested in this. And so by the time we get to 1877, what it is an effort on the United States government to sort of corral the non-treaty Nez Perce onto the smaller reservation.
And who was Chief Joseph? What was his role in that? Because you mentioned that there were all these different peoples, right? And that the U.S. government or just kind of wanted to lump them all into one.
Right, exactly. In fact, the term chief, I prefer to use the term headman. And the reason why I say that is because the term chief, it's a nice term that we have, and we like clean and tidy organizational flowcharts with scope of work and responsibility and that sort of thing. And the U.S. government's idea, it's very much a Anglo-European notion of social order, is if you get one person's signature on a treaty, then you have bound an entire community of people to certain limitations and behaviors. That idea of representation, which is a very Anglo-European notion of representation, right? And we all understand that if, whether we like our president or hate our president, he's our president, and those are U.S. policies. We all kind of understand that. That's not the way Native American groups understood themselves with one another. Anyway, so who was Chief Joseph? I'm going around the book. There were his father, Chief Joseph, the elder and the younger. Chief Joseph the elder was one of the fellows who refused to sign that treaty of 1863. And he raised his son to never sell the land upon which your father's bones rest. And so he died, and his son, Chief Joseph, in the Wallowa territory, emerges as kind of the I would say the political leader. His brother Elliott was, I would say, the military genius behind them. But it was Joseph and Elliott who the U.S. government was dealing with during that conflict of 1877.
And they were there at Whitebird, and then all the way through the march up to
that's exactly
towards the Canadian border.
That's exactly right. Yes. So they were kind of the front head men of the Nez Perce group. But it represented kind of an affiliation, a collection of several non-treaty groups. You have Tehulhuzit, who was in Hells Canyon. He was at Pecunin. You have Joseph and Elliott. They were Wallowas, and there were others represented as well.
And how long, you said it was a matter of months or years?
Yes, months. So Whitebird Canyon was June 17th, 1877, and the surrender at Bear Paw was in early October, and the snow had just started to fall. The Nez Perce were beset with, they were basically attacked. A handful of them actually did cross the Canadian border at the time under the leadership of Whitebird, after whom the canyon is named.
Oh, wow.
But famously, Chief Joseph delivers that famous speech, "I will fight no more forever. Our children are hungry and dying. Our old people are dying. We have no blankets," and that sort of thing. And so that's one of the famous speeches of the American West, his surrender at Bear Paw.
Yeah.
But that was October. So June to October, 1877. Okay. Yeah. An important part of the backdrop to that was that the previous engagement but out here in the American West was 1876, and in Montana, that was the Battle of Little Bighorn, when George Armstrong, Custer basically got routed. Hundreds and hundreds of men were killed by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, that whole crew. And back in the War Office, General William Tecumseh Sherman was in charge at that time. And if you think about this in context, you have the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, and then the very next conflict by the United States Army is Whitebird Canyon. And General Sherman was not about to let the U.S. Army be embarrassed. And so kind of the ruthless drive on the part of the United States against the Nez Perce, if you think of General Sherman, this guy who marched to the sea through the South, that sort of thing, is the one who's kind of barking down orders. And that helps to explain kind of this fixation the United States government had upon dealing with these Nez Perce who had embarrassed them at Whitebird Canyon. It's a real tragedy.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Where, so there's tours, there's, what are some of the sites that you would encourage people to go visit, and what are, so you said kind of you lived here for a while before you really dove into it. What are some things that we should kind of listeners should go
Visit.
see, and what are ways to learn about that?
Well, Whitebird Canyon, of course, is very important. And if you can get someone to guide you, someone from the Nez Perce National Historical Park, hop onto one of my tours, it really helps you to understand the flow of the battle. There's an interpretive kiosk by Highway 95 that's up above it there. And I think it's really hard to make out what actually happened in the battle from there. It really does take a guide. So Whitebird Canyon would be very important. The Spalding site, that's the headquarters site of the Nez Perce National Historical Park, which is about 10 miles east of Lewiston along Highway 95. That's the site of Henry Spalding's mission, the historic site of the mission, and that's an important place to visit. Then there are places along the Clearwater River that are important. I was over at Kamei, the Heart of the Monster. Some of the stories that I was telling, if you know where to stop, sometimes you need guides to know some of the other spots, but Heart of the Monster is pretty well interpreted out at Kamei.
And is that, so the Spalding mission, is that where you'd find the guide and get set up with kind of that, all that information?
And if you, reach out to the Nez Perce National Historical Park, and that's where the visitor center is there. If you can make your way over to Montana, Big Hole National Battlefield, which I would say, while the Whitebird Canyon is in our region, the most important battle site of that whole conflict would be Big Hole, which is a beautiful drive. You drive through the Lolo Trail to get there. Just the journey to get there is really well worth your while.
Where's Big Hole in Montana?
That's by Wisdom, Montana. So if you go from where we are here on the Palouse, you follow Highway 12 almost to Missoula, but you turn south right after you cross the Lolo Pass there. You turn south, and you can Google it, Big Hole National Battlefield. But it's got its own visitor center and interpretive films and such. That really helps you to appreciate the tragedy of the War of 1877.
So is that is that the trail of the war? So started at Whitebird and went up basically.
Yes.
Lolo.
Exactly. The Nez Perce, if you look at this, and you can see a map of their journey until it comes to just south of the Canadian border, and it looks like they took kind of a meandering route, but they believed that they were just simply dealing personally with General Oliver Otis Howard, who was out here, and he was the general on the scene, who they were dealing with, and it was his troops. They were working under his orders at Battle of Whitebird Canyon, and they knew that General Howard's jurisdiction was extended to the Continental Divide. Oh. And so they thought, we're just dealing with General Howard, and so we get away from him and we're fine. And then and it was hard for them to understand that comes back to what I was saying about Chief, when you're dealing with someone, representation, and there's a whole apparatus that extends to the East Coast that they're dealing with, not just, and so the plan A was to get away from General Howard, and then they're attacked at Big Hole. They realize, we're not done. And they were able to sort of counterattack and escape being caught at Big Hole. And then they move through, and they thought, well, we'll interact with the Crow. We've hunted with them, and we'll just sort of get protection from them. And this is when they actually go through Yellowstone National Park. And the Crow said basically, we sympathize with you, but we don't want you, we don't want the government coming after us too. And so plan C is to head up to Canada, where Sitting Bull was, in the wake of 1876. and Custer's Last Stand, the Battle of Little Bighorn. After that, Sitting Bull had gone up to Canada, and so that was where the Nez Perce were heading. So if you think about, they kind of, their objective shifts, and that explains the meandering route that they take.
Yeah. Interesting.
Do you have any recommendations on books, your top picks for learning more about it?
Yeah, if you want to, let's see, Alvin Josephy's book, Nez Perce and the Opening of the Northwest, gives, that's a pretty big fat book, some 600 or 700 pages. It's excellent. And I would say one of the best. The best book, there are many books that have been written on the war. My favorite go-to book is by Elliott West. It's called The Last Indian War. And so those are the go-to books that I would go to. And then, there's a condensation of Josephy's book that's about 120 pages that I recommend most highly because most people don't have the stamina for the 600-page version. And Josephy, and I'm trying to remember, it's something like Nez Perce Country or something like that. And it's a condensation of his 600-page book. And it's a really well done condensation. So if you just want the 120-page version, which I think many people probably do, that's the one to go for.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We'll wrap that up there for now. I'm sure we'll want to have some more discussions later.
Oh, there's so much to talk about. So much to talk about.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time. And
thank you so much. I'm always happy to talk about history.
Thanks for joining us. Like, share, subscribe. We'll see you next week.